On Wednesday, November the 15th, we'll call over the City of Winooski Special City Council meeting. We'll ask that everybody first join us, rise and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance led by Deputy Mayor Brian Corrigan.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a pretty condensed agenda tonight, so we did not put on the agenda an agenda review because there's nothing to review. I will take an opportunity, though, to open up for any public comment because we generally require that, to see if there's anything anybody would like to address the council about that's not on tonight's agenda. We're all here for the consent agenda, right? To know if we passed the minutes from last week, right?
That's what it is.
Okay, so we'll move on to the consent agenda. We have one item on the consent agenda tonight, which is approval of the City Council, City Council and Liquor Control Board meeting minutes from November 6, 2017. I entertain a motion for approval of the consent agenda as presented.
So moved.
Motion by Brian Corrigan, second by Eric. Any further discussion? Hearing and seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those opposed, motion carries. Now move on to the regular items. The first item tonight is a quasi-judicial hearing in relation to order of police labor agreement in a hearing that in regards to a step 3 grievance. We received notice shortly before the meeting today that this issue has been resolved and withdrawn. So at this time we will cancel that quasi-judicial hearing and move forward with our other agenda items. Any questions or concerns from council?
Nope.
Any questions or concerns from the public? Good. Seeing and hearing none, we will move on. Item B, discussion Myers Pool overview of timeline and tax impact.
So at the last meeting, you approved allocation of $92,500 to do the preliminary engineering of the pool, and that led us into a discussion where it became pretty clear that there was that we had not communicated well some of the implications of the Myers Pool project. So we have provided you a memo answering some of those key questions, and those key questions are what can we expect through the preliminary engineering phase, which is the phase we are now entering into. Is it possible to fast track this work in time to meet the deadline for a March town meeting day bond vote? What are the following stages of the project after preliminary engineering, and what are the timelines associated with each? And what are the overall cost implications of the project? So we've outlined the answers to those questions in the memo sent out and posted online for viewers to look at. We're happy to walk through them if that would be useful.
Maybe like 90 seconds on
Sure.
each, just to summarize what's on, in case folks didn't get a chance to take a peek.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Ray, I'll start, but clearly jump in as I go. So the first question is, what can we expect out of preliminary engineering? So obviously, far before me, the pool committee met and did a lot of work around options for the Myers Pool and worked on conceptual plans. The price tag associated with those conceptual plans is $4.4 million, and I think the community kind of rallied around a design and moved it forward to you in August. Those are massing concepts, conceptual concepts, so to move forward to financing, we need to go through this preliminary engineering phase. The result of that work, which is the money you allocated at the last meeting, are a schematic design, so what traditionally is thought of as like a 30% design, a geotechnical study, and a technical cost estimate. So that's when we have a better sense of what's in the ground, what are the costs associated, what's the beginning stages of design to get a more fine-tuned cost estimate that can be then used to go into the financing phases. So those are the 3 major deliverables we'll see in the next 4 months. That's geotechnical report, schematic drawings, and a detailed cost estimate. You asked us to look at whether it's possible to fast track for a March bond vote. So Ray and the team did meet with our engineers to look over that question. What we indicate in here is, well, technically that would be possible pending a horrific snowstorms in the next couple of months, because the geotechnical work and survey work really is outdoor work. While it's technically possible, we do not recommend it. We talked about this a little at the last meeting. What that would mean if we fast-tracked it would be, very quick turnaround time by the engineer, a short window. The data we would be bringing to you, be bringing to you right at the end of January, so you'd have maybe a meeting, maybe two, to look at that information and decide whether to move it forward. It would really limit the ability to weigh that budgetary impact against other budget discussions. It would certainly increase exposure for the project, so we wouldn't do the same fine-tuned engineering analysis as we would do through the 4-month process that they're recommending, and therefore the project in the future could be in jeopardy. Fast-tracking it also doesn't allow us to go look for other funding to offset the use of local dollars. So just today we've moved forward with a CCRPC brownfields grant to try and offset some of that cost. If we need to move forward with that work in advance, we won't have those funds accessible. So then there was a question about, so what happens next? If we complete preliminary engineering, go to bond vote, can we be under construction next summer? So one of the things we want to be very clear about is in big capital projects like this, there are several really important stages, and preliminary engineering is a very initial stage of that process. So what we've tried to outline here and with a Gantt chart provided by the engineer is those different phases that happen next. So preliminary engineering, the result is the geotechnical work, the 30% design. Following that, we enter into the financing phase where we decide as a community how we're going to put the money together for the project, likely take a bond vote. It's about a 65-day phase. Once we get a financing approval, we move into design development, which is moving those engineering plans from 30% to 100% design. So all the nitpicky details of where pipes are going to go and where tile is going to go and what the insides of the building are going to look like, etc. Following the approval of that final design, we move into construction documents. So then those drawings are transferred from kind of engineering drawings to what the contractor is going to want to see, so they know what to build on site. It's about a 55-day process. From there, as a municipality, we clearly have to bid out the work. So we put an RFP on the street, say, here are the design documents, firms, contractors in the area, respond to this RFP. It's about a 45-day process to have that RFP on the street, give people time to respond, review responses, and have the council approve. And then finally, Weston and Sampson, and then once you have a contractor on board, obviously you move into construction. Weston and Sampson is estimating about a 380-day construction timeline, so it's about a year worth of construction. It's very important to note that given winter construction climate, and probably we all know this, projects often have to go into winter shutdown. So given that the stages that come after preliminary engineering, even if we go to a bond vote in March, we will not be under construction next summer because we would still have to get through that design documents, construction documents, and bidding documents. If we were to fast track that and say we could get to construction documents in October and want to enter into contract for something to start immediately, we're likely going to get pretty elevated prices. You're going to get people who know we're desperate to get started and we're going to not get the best bang for the taxpayer dollar. So what we recommend, as outlined here, is to move forward with the preliminary engineering as approved, take a bond vote sometime in the spring, spend then the spring and summer going through the design development and construction phase, or design development and construction documents process in summer in 18, prepare to bid out the work in the fall or early winter of 18 to prepare for a 19 construction season start with a pool opening beginning of the 2020 summer, which I know is very disappointing, but I think it's a realistic engineering schedule. And then the final question posed was, what are the overall cost implications of the project? So we have presented, we've done some analysis on that, again, using the very high level construction cost estimate we currently have. So assuming a $4.4 million project, which is what we estimated as part of the conceptual plans, that could easily change as we get through preliminary engineering, at 3.75 interest rate, which is the market rate in the bond bank right now, and then assuming the $100,000 of operating costs to run the pool once it's opened, we're looking at about a 9-cent impact to the tax rate. So that's about a $220 bill increase for a $225,000 assessed home, but a $1,100 impact for $1 million business. So, did I miss anything significant, Ray?
That was great.
Okay. That is what we presented.
So I want to start off by saying thank you for putting together what I think is the most comprehensive summary clearly to date that has the different steps involved, so we can talk about those in a really clear, transparent perspective, not just from our seats, but obviously for the public too, so that there's real understanding about what is going to unfold. The really hard part about this is there's energy that exists, right? And when people get to put stickers on pictures and talk about what they want to see, that can really charge folks up and get people excited for something. And this is a good reminder, I think, and something that we should come back to time and time again and have very present in any kind of conversations we have about this, be it staff, be it pool committee members, which I want to acknowledge all of you and all the work that you've done and all the time that you've put into this. I know it's been an incredibly long haul. This was a conversation that really kind of, I won't say came out of nowhere. It's one that we knew we were going to have, but it's one that we got spurred into by a situation where it just wasn't feasible to operate anymore. But I do appreciate that there's been effort to put this into the correct timeline, because I think we need to be honest in saying in the past we've had some issues in being really clear on what the timeline would look like from the public perspective, and I think we've said a couple different things throughout this process, and I don't think any of us are very happy about that on either side of this room or sitting in those chairs. So it's very good to see something like this that I think we can count on and rely on, even though some of the dates I'm sure are making people's hands ring a good deal. One thing I want to ask about is something that's not addressed in here is alternative forms of funding, and there was quite a bit of discussion around fundraising and whether or not there was grant and or other participatory funds from other sources that might impact this.
Yep. I'll speak to grants, and then Jesse, I may ask fundraising wise if you can help chime in too some. But so grant wise, we've done some preliminary research. I think what I would say is there's not a ton out there. Land and Water Conservation Fund is a big grant, statewide grant pool that will be coming up. Next cycle is 2018. I believe that caps out at $100,000 per project. Mm-hmm. So not a small amount of money, but certainly not an amount of money that's going to push this thing across the finish line. I absolutely, if we're still, moving in this direction at that point, expect that we would apply for that funding. Again, as with any grant, it's not a guarantee, but I think we'd have a competitive project. Worth noting too that that's the funding source that built this pool back in the 70s. So there's some, I think, interesting history there too. Certainly from a fundraising perspective, there is, I think, an appetite and a willingness on the part of the pool committee, and I'll speak for you guys and let you throw tomatoes if I'm way off, but I think there's a real desire to be participatory and involved in a fundraising process. I think they've, at points in the discussions to date, set some pretty audacious and admirable goals around fundraising. I think 2.7 was the number we were working around. That's a huge lift for a volunteer group. And so I think there's, again, I appreciate that ambition. I think there's a reality there too that's a very long stretch. And
I just want to quickly say too, we're going to ask just a few questions of staff to kind of set the table a little bit, and we will be opening this up. So you'll absolutely have opportunities to. Sorry, Ray.
No, that's fine. So we've certainly had some good discussions with Jeff Myers. He is the son of Ken Myers and has a foundation that has been established already. It's been, I can't remember when, Mike,
if you remember when that was established. It's been a number of years.
A number of years.
The whole purpose of the foundation is to raise funds in support of the Myers Pool. There is some money in that foundation at this point. Again, not a huge amount, but Jeff has been very willing to be part of a conversation and a plan. Beyond that, it's a lot of little drops in the bucket that I think will take a pretty heavy lift to fill that bucket up.
Having staff involved in fundraising is appropriate in any way, shape, or form, to be really blunt, other than to acknowledge it's happening, provide information for it. I mean, that's absolutely correct. And in part too, because it then puts you in a compromising situation when the people you're asking for money ask us for something, or we have to give them a yes or no on something. And that's not a position that's at all, I think, not implied that we would do that work. I think the conversations that had kind of been running around was that there might be a separate fundraising group set up, and I was wondering if there was any formalized progress on that in terms of.
No, I think another piece, and again, feel free to correct me if I'm off point with this for the committee members. I think there's been a general acknowledgement amongst that group that the group that carried the project to the point we're at is a different group than the group that's going to carry the fundraising piece forward. It's not to say there's not some overlap there, but I think generally the skill sets and frankly in some ways the time and interest levels too of the committee members is different. I think the folks who've been with us to date in some cases have been content experts. I think Cindy and Jess in particular who've had experience, running that pool. We don't have any formal fundraisers or folks with that type of experience necessarily on that committee at this point.
Are you saying Mike doesn't make good baked goods?
I'm not. I would buy a brownie for sure, but I think it's a different skill set. We've been fortunate. Carolyn Smith has brought her father-in-law, who's got some fundraising background, in to sort of do some informal advising and consulting with us, which has been super helpful. But beyond that, I think we're definitely kind of acknowledging there's a need to look at adding some depth to that group.
I think another potential timeline to explore from myself reading this is how long it would take to get reasonably hard numbers to support a vote on a frankly different number that's not the entire project, that is realistic. And I'm just starting a conversation here, so by all means, counsel. But I think what I would want to see from that conversation is us giving, for lack of a better word, though, a number that says, to be realistic about what we think we can afford, and what we think from a municipal tax-based growth standpoint, what we can sustain and what this community will actually support. I think something we would need to talk about is whether or not there's a number to say alternative funding needs to be this percentage of the project, and understand how long it would take to get through that process, both in understanding what that number might be, but also in how long it would take to actually reach that goal. Because those would also have to be finite dates. There's too many stories of fundraising projects that meandered on for years, with a thermometer that finally fell down, right? But I'm saying that's I mean, we've got to really start, I think, putting some hard time fences around this. Okay, I've been talking a bunch.
To that point, I think that also should inform some of our process on the preliminary engineering. If we think we might be going in that direction, we should ask the engineers to give us estimates of cost escalations over a year or two. I think often when you do construction cost estimates, you're estimating them in this construction season with an escalator, a market-based escalator for the next construction season. They can do that out a few. It's harder when it gets out 5 or 10, but we can certainly ask Weston and Sampson to look at that as an option as well. Just so we don't get into trouble of saying, okay, it's $3.8 million now, and we're actually building it 3 years later, and that 3.8 is now 4.2 again.
So thank you very much for doing this. I think the frustration that was expressed at the last meeting was, really keyed off of the town meeting vote. But what I'm taking away, and the fact that it wasn't likely that that was gonna work, which was inconsistent with our beliefs for whatever, whether or not we were justified in having those beliefs. Some of us had those. But if I'm reading this correctly, even if there was a vote on town meeting day, construction could not begin next summer anyway. And so the recommendation is to have a different vote on a different date later in the spring, once the preliminary engineering process is concluded. Is that correct? So, a 9-cent property tax increase is very significant. And I wonder whether the scenarios that were discussed by the pool committee ever really touched on this level of analysis that says, if it's a $4.4 million project and includes estimated operating costs of this, that's going to translate into a tax rate impact of this. Because what feels to me may have happened is people got really excited about different conceptual drawings, saw a price tag, but that's a very abstract figure. And a lot of energy around fundraising, but I wonder at this point, is there an ability to revisit some of those conceptual drawings and do this level of analysis that says, I mean, it's another way, I think, of getting at your point
You
of
draw a line of this is what.
9 cents is a lot. What are we willing to let go of, if any, to get it to a ballpark of, and what are the contingency plans if we have $1 million fundraising goal? And I'd be interested in a structured conversation with the pool committee and the engineering team around the intersection between choices and tax rate impact.
So, and I would say, and I don't have
And
all
how
those,
that interacts with the timing, I guess.
and I don't have all the different options committed to memory in terms of what those price tags were. We looked at, I believe, 8 different options, and those varied a fair bit in terms of that high-level cost estimate number. I want to say the low was 2.8, and the high was like a little over 5. So we did see at that point some fairly different design options. I think that what we were really trying to do is not start a value engineering process too early, because I think the concern, I'll speak for myself, I think my concern in trying to guide that process was that if we start with a conversation of how cheap can we do this thing, I think you don't give yourself any wiggle room to come down without really compromising the quality of the product at the end of the day. I think the other piece that the committee very admirably tried to do is get to a design that reflected what they heard when we asked the community what it wanted. And so I think that 4.4, while it landed sort of in the middle to slightly above middle on that spectrum, I think was the best design from the group's perspective in terms of meeting what the community expressed as a concern or as a desire.
But if you can't get the financing because the community won't support a 9-cent property tax rate increase, then it's sort of moot.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that's sort of, in my opinion, the next phase of this conversation. We now have a ballpark that we're in, and I think it does become a community conversation about, a willingness or ability to shoulder that. Or to your point, Seth, is there some happy medium where we say, what's the absolute most this community will carry, and you guys go out and figure out the difference.
Ray, the estimated cost on that was high to begin with anyway, wasn't it? Didn't Mark? I thought he said that the estimated cost was high because of the contingency plan in there.
So there are some contingencies baked into those numbers, those 4.4, 2.8s, and that's spelled out, I think, in documentation you've had in the past. So there's a percentage for engineering contingency and for hazardous material contingencies as well. So I think, as we mentioned at the last meeting, that 4.4 number could come down. It could also very well go up depending on what this next phase finds us. So, and I guess, so to answer the other part of your question, did we have an explicit analysis of this level with the pool committee? Not necessarily. I also feel, though, that we did throughout the course of the project talk about at a high level what the impact would be. At one point, I think we threw out a number of 225 that we, like back of a napkin, based on a bond vote and some rough operating. So we were in a pretty 225 annual
increase
impact
on
for a $225,000 home. So very much within a ballpark of where this project kind of is showing that it's going to be. But I think at that point we weren't at a stopping point of saying this is DOA, so let's step away and move to Plan B. I think it was more of a yikes, that's a big number, but let's get to the end of the portion of this project that we were tasked with, which is coming out with a design.
Right. I just wonder, when you say have a conversation with the community about whether they're willing to pay that amount, it seems a little bit, that's a tough place to have that, just to say, do you support a 9-cent property tax rate increase for this pool, yes or no? Maybe a more successful conversation, a more fruitful conversation in terms of giving us a direction. If it's, here's what this looks like for 9 cents, here's what it looks like for 5, I don't know if we could go below 5, but, a range of options before the engineers get too far down a road specking out that project. That's just a thought for consideration.
And you could start with that foundation and then have people say, well, we really want that, and it's, well, okay, well then
We're gonna have to do some fundraising.
have to figure out a way to get there. 'Cause
Yeah.
this is, so figuring out, yeah.
Because this is not the only project.
Microeconomics, you gotta get those lines. to-
Yeah,
Ron?
yeah.
For the record, I'm Ron Stokan. I was a liaison from the Community Service Commission to the pool committee for a number of months. And there was some considerable discussion about the cost and what the community could bear. To that end, there was discussion about a logical target for fundraising. And the suggestion was 2.5 to 2.7 million, which would leave a much smaller balance for a bond issue. I don't think at any point the pool committee was prepared to understand that the city would haul the whole load. We didn't talk about 9 cents or anything like that, but we did talk about a bond issue of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million, which would be considerably less than 9 cents. So there was recognition of some of the things that you're asking about in the pool committee. We did also talk about aspects of the pool design that could be dropped if necessary. But again, I would say the pool design that was presented to the council is a design based on our best understanding of what the community desires. And so there's probably some reluctance to drop aspects, but
One of those doors has to be open.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, sorry, Ron. One of the doors, like, legally has to be open.
yes,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was essentially finished. So
Sorry about that.
It was also discussed in the features, and I'll just use diving boards as an example because it's an easy one. Everybody wants a diving board. They are expensive because your pool needs to be a certain depth, also from an insurance standpoint. And so in taking in the considerations of what the community wants, there were certain things that we quickly did eliminate, knowing that it would increase costs of build, but also costs of running. So we certainly had in our minds things like that. And there was also a lot of conversation around how to generate revenue from the pool. And so we kept in features that would create revenue, looking at that overall cost as well as the operational costs. Because you have a rough estimate of $100,000 to run that pool. And so if you just have a bare bones hole in the ground pool, am I gonna wanna have my birthday party there? Whereas if there's a slide, boom, we have revenue generating income there. If it's lights, we have revenue generating income. So there was a lot of conversation around features that could be kept that were lower cost to build, but could create revenue for the pool instead of just simply having a hole in the ground that was, you know, the most recent Myers pool.
Yeah.
So I just want to speak to that it definitely was on the forefront of the committee's minds.
I think it's helpful to look at the tax implications by breaking out what component of that 9 cent potential impact is operating costs and what component is debt service. And so just looking at the numbers, obviously it changes throughout the year as we pay down the principal, but especially in the first few years, it looks to be between 70 and 80% of that tax impact would be debt service, with about a quarter, 25% of it being annual operating costs, which is, you know, between 2 and 2.5 cents would be the tax impact for annual operating costs. So I think really if we're looking at what is the biggest component of that tax impact, it is the debt service on that, and depending on what the number the city would have to bond, I mean, that I feel like is the principal discussion around financially what this means for our community. So I think it looks like, I mean, regardless, the tax impact for annual operating costs is going to be roughly what it's going to be. And really the opportunity for wiggle room is on the debt service.
And rates are going up probably 3 times next year. Take to the bank, put it on camera. Christine?
I'm somewhat new to this discussion, sort of. I've looked it out, but I hear the word "if" a lot, I guess, coming out of different groups. You know, if we move forward with this, if this is feasible. I guess I was blinded to the fact that I thought we had a plan, and those who were working on this, that this was moving forward, that we had a timeline. As a project manager, it all sounds very fuzzy now, where I don't know this is moving forward. I don't know who's driving this. It sounds like we still have a lot of initial questions. You laid out a timeline. Is that timeline still feasible with all these questions everyone's talking about up front? Can these be answered in time for some sort of vote in the spring? These seem like pretty big questions. We have to go back to the community. That takes time. It's November. I'm just wondering if you really think that timeline is feasible with all the questions that have come up so far.
I just want to answer the first question about if, and that's because anything like this that we do is totally contingent on the people who vote it passing a bond and saying, yeah, to pay for it. Yeah.
Whether or not we feel we're going to move forward with the project.
Yeah.
So this group still feels like they want to move forward with the project.
Yeah.
So the if is more if we put it in front of the community says no.
Right, and what that looks like. So I wouldn't take our, you know, we've been really committed to seeing this project through, I think, but there's always we have to put this up for a vote. And so when we say if, it's always contingent upon the voters giving us the green light to say, yes, you can move forward.
All these questions come out, they're great questions.
Yeah.
Because what's swirling in my head is, if they hadn't pushed the timeline, when would these questions have been answered or asked, and by who?
Well, that's where we're at in the conversation discussion. I mean, that's what came out of the last meeting was we clearly need to clean this up and clean up the timeline. I mean, that's where we're at. This group's also been working for over a year on this project.
Right.
So, yeah.
So as a community member, I can answer some of your questions.
Yeah.
We have sort of been on hold since the summer. We haven't had any meetings because we've been waiting for approval from the city council to move forward on the studies around the ground and everything. So as the committee, we haven't gone any further. We were told at one of our last meetings that Ray and the city employees could no longer be part of the committee. And so the current committee is trying to regroup.
Okay.
They're trying to regroup to see what the next steps are and to broaden it and to get a fundraising committee as part of the current committee. Because a lot of members on the current committee aren't feeling like they can be part of the fundraising part of it. They just don't feel like they have the capability of
So
doing
your
that.
committee is going to go forward and answer all these questions everyone's asking?
No,
So,
that's for staff. We're the place where we need the people
Right,
we
so
pay
this-
to be
this whole
professionals to
thing
answer those
tonight,
questions.
This is the first time that I'm even seeing any of this, and I'm on the school committee. So this is the first time that I've seen a timeline, first time that we've gotten any figures about how much it would cost on bond vote. When I received this, I was very shocked myself, because nowhere during any of this process was it our intention to ask the city to pay for the whole thing. Nowhere was that ever our intention.
So now,
So to see this piece
okay,
of
hold
paper
on.
saying,
So
I'm not done yet.
I appreciate that, but we're gonna get back to the meeting because this is a business meeting, and I appreciate that there's frustration.
I'm just explaining to
No,
you.
I understand, and I tried to give that a little time, but I understand, and you can absolutely address any of those comments here and the frustration here. No, I understand. What happens when that starts though is it ends up becoming just a.
Then I'll look forward.
We can talk to us too. I want to give staff a chance though too to address any of those concerns that were just brought up.
Yep, so I can't actually see you. Hi. Yeah. That's okay. So to answer what I think I remember your question, Cindy. So the timeline we laid out is the timeline moving forward, kind of a best case scenario timeline. So what if everything went smoothly and voters approved and we move forward with the design kind of conceptually as planned, bonding the whole project, I'm pretty confident in that timeline outlined. If we are changing some of those goalposts and saying, okay, we're going to move forward with preliminary engineering, we're going to get a hard number, council is then going to set a goal of, okay, within this hard number, this is what we're willing to raise through a bond vote, community, can you raise the rest otherwise? That timeline's not factored into this process. So no, I think answering some of these questions that are coming up tonight could potentially change the timeline of this process. In terms of who is leading the effort, and I'm also new to this conversation. I think that it's being jointly led. I think there's a lot of community work that has gone into this through the pool committee, and we certainly don't want to lose that active involvement. However, I do think it has shifted to a staff-led project as of the last council meeting with the approval of the funds to do the engineering work. So our staff, Ray Coffey, and our DPW project manager, Ryan Lambert, are now the leads on moving that engineering work forward. So from a very kind of technical professional management side of that, that's what we are now leading forward. What I was referring to earlier about fundraising, that is work I feel like we need to step out of and look to the community to do. Certainly, to the extent that the pool committee continues to meet, the city will be at the table for those discussions. If there is solely a fundraising board stood up, we would ask to be invited as needed to provide information, but don't necessarily need to be involved in every step of that process. Did I miss any of your questions?
No, I think I have it. Maybe just more that I'm just trying to make sure that, in my mind, I understand that the decision on the pool, how much we're going to tax, possibly tax for property tax increases, that is an ongoing discussion while you can still start the engineering work, while we can still plan for a possible vote in the spring. But between now and the spring, we have to start having a good idea about how much everything costs and how much we're going to ask the public for. And that just seems like a fairly big lift between now and the spring.
We're also, by the way, going to put together a budget and pass that. So just that,
work on Main Street.
just that little thing.
I guess I'm also wondering the priority of the pool
Yeah.
as compared to all these other things you're naming.
I got a quick question. In your opinion, if it will not make, if you think March is too soon for the bond vote, correct? When do you see it being ready to go to bond then? And you're talking spring, March is spring. Is it going to be April, May?
So in the project timeline, our engineers have laid out, which is available on the website. They will complete the cost estimating work the middle of March, so about March 13th is per their schedule. So then assuming that comes to the council, then we have notice periods required for a bond vote. So if we're going straight from cost estimate to bond vote, no intermediate discussions about other funding options, I think the soonest we could do that would be mid-April, sometime between mid-April and the end of April.
You're gonna want a discussion with us, we're talking May.
Sorry, and then, yep, there are potentially lots of other discussions.
Yeah, and that's based on the timeline that's presented here, not with these additional questions that we have about funding. I mean, that would be just running a straight line number forward.
Right, exactly.
The bond application deadline is May 15th.
May 15th. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Cindy, I cut you off.
So what kind of timeline, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of timeline for fundraising did the committee think was viable? Like, did they think they could raise $2.7 million in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
We haven't had that conversation
Okay.
because we've been kind of on hold
Right.
as to,
Our next step, I think, is to get our fundraising committee in line and to figure out who we're gonna elect, so to speak, to be the professional fundraiser. Whether we have to bring one in from outside, or if someone in our committee, which we have a member that has a retired one who's a professional fundraiser, who's given us good points on how we're gonna go after the big fish, so to speak. But that's where we're at right now. We've been kind of stalled, basically waiting for the Brownsfield grant money and the funds to start the environmental study. If that fails, then we're back to
We're back to-
scratch.
yeah,
So we need to
exactly.
get that done. We were trying to get that done in August, not November. And here we are, November. So I think once we gear up again, our committee will have understanding of what we need to do for fundraising and who wants to be involved in that. Whether we get some outside people coming in, but we definitely need that head professional fundraiser to assist us on getting the most bang for our buck, so to speak.
Understood. So even, only reason I ask is that it sounds like the major lift is gonna have to come from the taxpayers, at least at the initial point of it, because you can't start a project of this size. We can't go out to bond for $2 million, and then at the end of $2 million, wait for fundraising to come in to be able to finish a project. You follow me? So it sounds like the major lift is gonna have to come from the taxpayer regardless. Now, whether the fundraising is a pay down method or how that money is used, I don't really understand all that. I'm not gonna pretend to. That's why we have Angela.
So,
I guess I'm also I'm surprised, and I'll look both ways as to why there's been no conversation about fundraising up to this point. And I'll look to you guys if that's conversations you guys have had, or yeah, sure.
I can speak to that. There was, from day one, there's been a lot of conversations around fundraising.
Yeah.
Even when the pool was still operational, I'd always be in touch with Mike's family and they'd be like, so what's going on? And we all knew the pool was dying. And so there's always been conversations about fundraising, how to keep it going. And then when we realized it was unsafe to operate, that was the first conversation. Like, we need money, like, let's fundraise. So the conversation has always been there, happening. When we had to close the pool to keep the momentum of the pool going, it very much was, the sky's the limit. Like, that's where you want to start any conversation about a new project.
Yeah.
And that's what Ray really imparted to us, which we're grateful for, of if we're gonna do this, we wanna do it right. So let's start up here and then work our way down, and not think about money, because we do wanna do it right. And so as we started to see some price tags, again, I'll go back to diving boards, it was like, okay, yeah, it's not gonna be an option. We knew that. So the finances were always thought about, were always discussed, but not knowing the process with fundraising within a city. Me speaking a little bit to my fundraising experience that I've had in the past, as well as what we're going through at my current place of employment, we knew that it was going to be a long process. But we didn't know the details of how it would play into the city and at what steps certain things had to happen. So when it got to the point when we had a conceptual design to move then forward to Mike's point, well, if the ground's not good, we have a big problem. So is there sense in really trying to put some targeted numbers to fundraising and spend the time and effort to do that and get a committee going and get that energy there? If we find we can't even build a pool on that site, no, there's not. So when it got to actually starting to crunch the numbers, before those numbers were crunched and brought back to us, the next step was really this initial ground testing and figuring out that, and then figuring out these timeline pieces. And that's where we left in the summer. This past summer, and where we've now just been waiting
Yep.
to figure out the timeline, what the next steps are, where the pool committee fits into the next steps, we're a pool fundraising committee. So that's really, I don't want it to feel that we sat here in a bliss being like, well, this is gonna be easy and we can have whatever we want. That's not the case at all. And many times it was brought up by committee members, how are we going to pay for this? And that was frankly pushed aside by many people saying, we don't know, but that's not the goal of the committee right now.
I sat in a couple of those meetings and reinforced that idea that was not your jobs to figure out how to put pen to paper on those things. That's not what that group was assembled to do. It doesn't make sense to ask them to do that. The next question I would ask is so there's a newer committee formed, or there's a band, it sounds like, of people at least having a conversation about who would like to fundraise. But that's really where that's at this juncture. Okay. I just want to, there's not like an advanced infrastructure created with a website.
I'm saying it's just so limited. I mean, you can only do so many bake sales or bingos for the pool or concerts at Landry.
Right.
That's not going to bring the money in.
No.
We need the professional fundraiser to come in and help us, get us pointed to the right direction, to get us organized with the literature and the presentation that we need for people to want to open their pocketbooks to us and, donate, make it part of their community as well. That's where we're at.
And that was part of the conversation too, that if we're gonna go out to the community, whether it's asking for $25 or $25,000 or $250,000, we need to have a plan.
Yeah.
We need to show them what they're doing, because to the point of we raise this money and then it doesn't happen, that's not an option. And so really trying to figure out how can we create a plan that everybody, the taxpayers, the city staff members, the pool committee's on board with, to then go out and ask for large ticket donations. Because yes, we have a conceptual drawing, but that's not enough to start asking people for $500,000, $100,000,
And something I point out to say that it's also not like we can say, hey, have $2 million by. There's not.
Right.
It sounds like to me there's no foundation really to work from in this case for that, from a reasonability and a time perspective. So going back to the earlier comment about fundraising, I think if we set some random number as some kind of goal, I think that I brought up as an idea, that would be for an undetermined amount of time. I don't think that would be easy to put a fence around in terms of how long it would take. That really concerns me from that perspective
I
too.
don't want to get off that note either, but I don't think we should stop. I think we should keep moving forward on all the other pieces of this puzzle.
Well, we put the money in last time too, Mike, to do that. So that's been, that is absolutely moving forward. I think
That with engineering, all those pieces are vital, and the fundraising will come, but we just have to get organized, basically.
Sorry.
What I'm hearing is that you need to wait for the results of the engineering study in order to begin a fundraising campaign. And what we heard tonight is that that's not going to be completed until March, which means holding an April or May bond vote doesn't, the timing doesn't seem to work very well in that regard. I also am concerned about holding a vote in June, when typically that's not a great time of year to get folks to turn out and vote.
What would you bond for at that point anyway?
Well, we wouldn't know.
Right.
It would be an arbitrary number, and it may not be enough to cover the project, and we don't want to, have the same experience that Rutland had, I don't think,
Yeah.
in terms
No,
of
no, we do
getting
not.
approval for an amount that's not gonna build the
Yeah.
pool that the community needs. So, November 2018, there's a big election, generally speaking. So,
It's a primary in August.
I wonder what a November vote, again, that maybe that's not, I don't know if 3 or 4 months is enough time to raise $2 million. I don't know what the fundraising plan is and what that timeline looks like. But I'd be interested in understanding, does this timeline still work in terms of construction taking place in 2019 and pool opening if the vote happens in November? No, it does not.
We would not be able to apply for the bond until May of 2019 if we were to vote in November of 2018.
Thank you.
Is it logistically possible with the bond history that you have or the bond knowledge you have to pay down bonds faster than the 20-year term? Like, is there a penalty for paying down bonds ahead of time?
So my understanding, we can research that, my understanding is that if you go through the Vermont Bond Bank, which is what we would do, you cannot pay them down early.
They're a pooled bond.
They're a pooled bond.
So from a.
I think the question maybe you're trying to ask is if we bond for, maybe I'm reading too much into your question, but if we bond for $4 million and only need $2 million because we raise another $2 million, can we take out less? I don't believe so, but we would have to research that.
Then is it a
We can
viable,
work with
then is it a viable option to take the fundraising money in a special bowl and pay the
It would not be
bond
the
with it?
fundraising money. You would have to use any unspent bond money to repay the bond. I mean, you could hold the fundraised money for bond repayment as well. That could work.
That would work?
You can do that?
I'm just trying to, because logistically speaking, there's just no viable way without having the committee already up and running, having $200,000 already established, so on and so forth, without having all that already pre-done. I just don't see a viable way to get to the bond vote with any logistical numbers other than the number we need to totally encapsulate this project. I just don't see how we could do that otherwise. I think you'd be
Fundraising should
selling it.
absolutely be held, and it would be restricted only for that debt because it would be coming from an outside source that raised it for that particular purpose.
Right, so we can pool that money just to pay down that debt.
Absolutely.
So the taxpayer in the end would still be paying that or would be paying less? I'm just trying to think about the whole.
They could pay less if we had a repayment schedule based on $4 million,
Yeah.
but had raised $2 million to pay that down, then in theory, year to year, over the course of the 20 years, we would have to raise less tax money because
Right.
we'd have this reserve we were paying that
Right.
debt service from.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You said it eloquently, thank you.
There's no way to apply it sooner than later against the.
That would have to be investigated at the time. of the-
Bondholders expect a certain timed payment and they like that. And when you throw it off, you get this lovely word called arbitrage that then gets passed back to
But
us in a
we could
prepayment
potentially
penalty.
use any fundraised monies prorated over time. You do bigger portions when the tax rate is higher and then lower it proportionally every year, phasing it out
How
when
much
we phase out the
reserve we
bond.
use.
Yeah, theoretically, you do a blended
Right.
version of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the way to do what you're suggesting is to front load the fundraising or delay the bond vote till we know the funds we've raised, and therefore you're taking out less in bond debt. So instead of $4 million, we'd be taking out a $2 million bond, then property taxpayers are, you pay the principal first, essentially.
The only cost to doing the bond for the entire amount, rather than waiting for the fundraising, is that you're essentially paying interest on the amounts that you also fundraised.
Yeah, no, that's understood, but without having a viable number to work from, you have to have at least the project encapsulated. So now my secondary question, Eric spoke to it earlier. The 4.4 is or is not inclusive of the expenses for running the pool. Are we gonna have to go back to the taxpayer
No.
for $100,000 every year on
Correct.
top of that?
Correct.
But it's baked into the
Yeah.
calculation on the tax, the
Oh, I
net
see.
tax
Yeah, the
impact.
spreadsheet
So not
you
on the
saw-
4.4, but on the tax rate you're referring to? Okay, thank you.
So with the
Thank you
current
for that
numbers, it'd
clarification.
be about 6 to 6.5
Right.
cents to pay the bond and 2 to 2.5 cents to pay annual operating costs.
Right.
For those at home, that's roughly $50,000 per penny on our tax rate.
Right.
That's
So
what
that
we-
$100,000 operating cost per year would be part of your yearly budget during budget
It,
time?
it would need to be part of the yearly operating budget. In addition to the debt service that was committed to. And that's all captured in the spreadsheet that's there. That's part of that 9.
You know, I think that's a good thought, but the fact is, if we're presenting a bond vote to voters, we're gonna have to explain what the tax rate impact is and say,
Absolutely.
there's a possibility it could be reduced if certain fundraising goals are achieved, but,
It doesn't feel like the right order.
I got a question, where's this $100,000 maintenance per year for the pool coming from?
The operating, so we got some numbers from Weston and Sampson on, for the type of pool that was proposed in that option, kind of rough numbers of electric, water, chemical, kind of the utility type pieces. We took what has been our traditional staffing expense for the pool, that's been a contract, and escalated that basically by 50%, because with 2 pools you would need additional lifeguards. So that number is included in there. I'm trying to remember, there's some custodial baked in, telephones and basic
Land
maintenance. So,
maintenance, all that stuff.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
An awful high number, especially with everything more efficient these days.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider now the pool we were running was roughly a $50,000 annual expense, and that wasn't inclusive of, and actually the $100,000 is also not inclusive entirely of the labor for public works that goes into opening and closing. So, yeah, so it's not a crazy number from an operating perspective. If anything, it might be ambitious.
Well, we would also want to build reserves and
Correct. Correct.
enterprise fund it. No, not enough income. I'm just.
I was gonna
I'm being
say, if you
facetious.
can come up with a revenue stream that would offset that.
It's just an idea.
but to that point, that $105,000 doesn't assume any revenue coming in.
It does not. Part of the reason there is that our traditional revenue on that pool has been very low. So I think in the interest of being conservative and not overextending ourselves on the revenue
Yeah.
side,
Yeah.
we didn't estimate that out. And again, with new facility, potentially new pricing structure, it's really hard to predict what that number would look like. Typically, our income on that pool is about 4,000 a summer. So pretty small drop in the bucket.
This has been a good meeting. I wish we would have had one of these when we started this meeting. Because I'm learning a lot of things here tonight that have been helpful the last several months, for sure. And I think we should have another committee meeting, get our whole committee together and discuss what we've learned here tonight and find out how we're gonna move on from here, because this has been very, very good.
All right, I think we're looking at some realities in the face too, in terms of timelines. So I want to make sure we're mindful of the decisions that actually need to be made and the timeline of those decisions, because that's not on here. I mean, it is. There's guidance on it, but we have to decide what those decision benchmarks are and how we're going to proceed. I guess, are there any other questions in regards to some of the details covered tonight on funding, financing? Yes.
Just to be clear, what is the next step? I guess it sounds like we still have to figure out how it's going to be paid for, and thus when the bond vote's going to be.
Yeah, so
So there is some group that's getting together to determine this?
there's an engineering study done. We have a budget in front of us. There's no other group that's necessarily required to do anything other than us. We could vote to put it in front of the voters. That's something that we could choose to do. We could vote to say, you know what, let's just scrap this whole thing and be done. I mean, that's not reality, right? What we did last week is commit money to doing all the engineering pieces to get that ball rolling. So the decision point is, number one, well, that's what we're going to talk about. I want these guys to have an opportunity to think about that, because really the decision is going to be, are we going to push to have this on a May ballot? And is this number acceptable, or do we want to see this number adjusted? I mean, that's what I see as the primary questions in front of us. There's a timeline presented here. It's not necessarily the timeline that has to be accepted. That's not going to make anybody happy to hear. But there could be a possibility of us having a conversation about what the benchmark we think from a funding perspective is reasonable, and giving time for there to be some fill-in funding acquired and accomplished, but that pushes the timeline off again. So we need to think through what those implications are and figure out if we want to push that funding forward or really pursue those if we think that there's real fruit there.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
I haven't seen the timeline, we'll look at it, but everything goes ahead as desired. When does the pool open? 2019, 2020? 20. So anything like taking your fundraiser before we put the bond in makes it 21.
If we don't get across, I think what we're hearing tonight is if we don't get across the funding from the municipal side, if we don't get across the funding finish line by the beginning of May, then we will be in 2021. Everybody's shaking their head, yeah. And the additional issue with that is stuff doesn't stay the same, it doesn't cost the same. Yeah, and rates and materials, all those things change. So then our numbers move a little bit, and it gets a little, that can play in. Now, that being said, there wouldn't be such an astronomical increase that we'd probably be looking at double the budget, but there's.
And that's barring any other bond votes that may push the pool down the ladder. So some other project could come along in the next year or two and
Be more of a priority.
be more of a priority than the pool.
Yeah, I don't. That's not the way we've structured any conversation. We've pushed on because of access to some federal funding around a Main Street project contemplation too, but it's not a prioritization between those two. That has not been a conversation that's been had here by any means, and it's not something that we've seen from staff. Well, we've covered it in 3 public meetings, so I mean, there's a lot of information out there about it. So I won't digress into the entire thing, but part of the question we've got a lot of infrastructure issues on Main Street because there's access to state and federal funding right now that we don't think is going to be around, and there's a lot of interest in investing in it, where we could get a really good deal in terms of a return of beyond matched funding, where we would just be a percentage of the money going into the deal. Where were we last time? You had conversations, for example.
Of a percentage of my.
Yeah, well, from a cost perspective, has anybody floated any numbers around in the last
It's
form?
so many different funding sources,
Yeah.
it's hard to.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at if you're talking about total project cost between $10 and $15 million project, and at least at this point, half a dozen different funding sources
Yeah.
coming into it. Some grants, some negative or low interest loans.
So that's a conversation we're having concurrently. It hasn't been a either or prioritization conversation. The speed on that has been more of a press from the outside, frankly, from the state and federal funders who are saying we don't know if this is going to be around very long or forever. So that's something that you want to look at, but that's not something that, for example, Ray from the community services perspective is engaged in on a daily basis, right? So that capacity is not coming from the same place.
Is the pool gonna fall under that economic development? Can it fall under that?
Can it fall under economic development funding?
I remember that, did that all happen for the whole Main Street, the whole Rotary area, the economic development chart that you guys
The
came
tip.
up with? Now,
No, I think are you talking about the economic development
Yeah.
plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I would say is it's sort of mentioned in that conversation about community amenities and supporting, vibrant neighborhoods. I would extend that as being something that's included in there, and I know it was talked about during some of those public meetings. We just had an initial overview of the economic development strategic plan, and it didn't touch on it in depth.
Okay.
Right now, the planning commission's out there working on the overall municipal plan that is a chapter of the economic development piece. Yeah.
Because, it is a pretty good sized project, and we get the money from that, another source of income for that, for pool development.
Yeah, we had kind of heard when this whole conversation started that this was a tougher thing to find, I call it magic money for, it's a tougher thing for magic money because, I think a lot of state or federal funders look at it as and I know that there's a lot of value to it. Nobody's questioning that, but they'll use the word like, "Is that necessary?" And we're having a community conversation about its value and what our priorities are, and that's a different conversation. But from a funding perspective, tends to be the way it's treated. It's either not scored highly or isn't an available use for funds. Yeah. Can we get us back on track?
Well, I mean, yeah, a little bit. But, I guess, and I don't know where the best place to have that conversation. If we need to now hold the conversation and make sure we have dedicated time on our agendas over the next few months to make sure this stays on track, or whether it's a pool committee and then report. I mean, I'm not sure where the mix of people is, where the right mix is for some of the pieces of this conversation. But it seems to me that there are some trade-offs that are gonna need to happen along the way. One is, if it's a top priority to open the pool in 2020, then, what are realistic fundraising goals? I don't know what those are, but it seems to me we ought to be able to get some information about that pretty soon so that we can all be on the same page around what's possible in a 6-month period, because then I think the discussion, if 2020 opening is a priority, then there has to be a discussion around what features are we willing to compromise on, and maybe, what is it that we can bond for, that we can, bid and build in time for 2020, and then have fundraising supplement in terms of features. I don't know anything about pools, and I don't know what makes sense in terms of what you can build later. I don't want to be in a position like Rutland was in, where we have a pool and they're bringing in like mobile homes for changing rooms, right? Like, I don't think that's what anybody wants, but we need to be really, really thoughtful around, number one, what are some reasonable, realistic fundraising targets and a time frame for those? If the decision is we want what the community said they want, but we need to be clear with them, that means it's not going to happen until 2021, then that's fine, but we all just need to be really, really clear about where the trade-offs are. Because it's appearing to me like we can't have it all on the timeline some of us want it to happen.
You can't do all those things.
And I just need to say, I'm not sure why we haven't dealt with this since August, because I'm pretty clear that most of us on this side are committed to moving this project along. So I need to be clear that I don't want to see another sort of lag in the action, because even if we're going to be delaying the project, there's a lot of discussion and decision that needs to be made around that.
It needs to be communicated clearly.
And I think you are absolutely right. We should have had this conversation a year ago. Better late than never.
Yep. Sure.
Well, and I can speak to a little bit of, you know, the features. There's been some conversation around the features of the pool, and in talking with with Mark from Weston and Sampson on the various things. The reality is we did talk about a slide and the cost associated with that slide. Could we have the fixtures to add on the slide? The features in the recommended design from the committee actually don't cost that much. Building a pool costs a lot of money.
Right.
And so, you know, I've heard a lot, like, well, can we eliminate things? Can we eliminate things? I firmly believe in the work that we did as a committee and also my professional knowledge of pools. The answer is probably no. To get, you know, to propose a design that's 2 million or 3 million and then the 4, we really weeded down, and the feature is another $200,000. It's not like we're gonna eliminate $1 million feature. And that's the reality, is that this project is expensive to build a pool, is expensive to operate a pool, is expensive in an area where it's operational 9 to 12 weeks, and that's really difficult to summon. And you guys have always made it a priority, which I appreciate as a professional in aquatics, and I heard a whisper that we're teaching kids to swim. It's a priority for everybody. Unfortunately, it's a priority in so many of our lives that comes with an incredibly high price tag that's not always respected by federal grants and, you know, the people that have money potentially, and that's really difficult, and that's where the passion and the frustration comes in. I deal with it professionally, and all of us in aquatics, it's so expensive to teach the skill that is life-saving, which is great, but that's the reality. And so I think in looking at this price tag, unfortunately, we will, whether it's the pool committee, whether it's a new revised committee of some sort, see if we can whittle down the price tag. We already did a lot of work on that, and I think it's going to be difficult. The reality is a harsh one.
So then I think the discussion is, what are some reasonable fundraising goals and timelines?
Yeah.
Right.
I think for what we put in, sorry, Ron, for what we put in it, I think the community would be more engaged at the pool anyway, because of the community room, the services that we're gonna offer there. You know, you're gonna have a deli that Joe Schmo can be walking down the sidewalk and get a sandwich, basically. I mean, there's gonna be some money generated from this pool. And if we keep taking away from it, then that money disappears to help pay for the pool. So it's expensive to do.
We got that building that pools your rent outside.
Yes.
Well, we might need your information.
Go find a town in Finland without a hot tub year round.
I would just like to observe that the reconstitution of the pool committee will be advanced, I think considerably, at the point that schematic drawings become available, because that will give them information about a more real cost. You know, we're estimating a cost of $4.4 million. We really don't know what the real cost is going to be. And the pool committee, as they move into a fundraising phase, needs to have more directed information that will be provided by schematic drawings, because we'll be able to put real numbers to that at that point. And, you know, at that point, the pool committee can then really actively get involved with fundraising in the community. There's already been discussion about who the major donors are likely to be, but the plan about how to approach those donors is waiting for some of that real information. You have to have all your ducks in a row before you can go and ask Mr. High Mighty so-and-so, you know, we want you to give $1 million.
Even 100,000.
You know, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, whatever the target ask is, the more concrete you can be with your ask, the better. So, you know, from a commission's point of view, I think that I can speak for the commission on this small regard. I would encourage the pool committee to keep in touch with us. We can't have a formal relationship because we're a city commission. We can't have a formal relationship to their fundraising activities, as I understand it. But I think they can tell us things that ought to be passed on to staff and council. And so I'd encourage that kind of relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I do really so tremendously appreciate the thought and the work and the insight that's gone in from the committee and the commission's perspective in getting us to this point we're at now, and do also feel a lot of regret that we weren't having this discussion back in, closer to August and getting some of this preliminary funding to do the engineer work. I would just say I don't want us to look at the work that will be done, a lot of the engineering work right now, as well as discussions around outside finance or outside financing and fundraising. It seems very much like there's that balance of like which one's the horse and which one's the cart and what we're going to put first. And in my perspective, they're both horses and the pool is the cart. And I think that in order for us to actually move forward on any sort of timeline that would get a pool built, we need to be doing both these things concurrently.
Yeah, and I think too, we've got a lot of work to do with the public, just generally. I think people need to recognize we've raised taxes 1.2%, 1.4%, 0.9 or 0.7% over the last several years, and kept the city moving forward and accomplished some pretty tremendous things in doing that, quite frankly. And I'm not shying away from that. We've done that in a massively fiscally responsible way, and we've done so trying to prep people that we knew that there were some infrastructure expenditures coming down the line, and we have pushed these humans as hard as we can possibly push them, and asked them to do way more than is reasonable, and pushed a lot of bounds in terms of sanity, I'm sure. And we need to have a really clear conversation with the community about what that looks like going forward, what impact this has now that there's a good number, and make sure that's really well vetted. This doesn't work if it goes forward and it falls apart from a matter of a public lack of understanding about the financial impact and an understanding of what the investment is. So I don't want to leave tonight without saying that, because I think that's really important. This represents a larger tax increase from the municipal perspective than we've had in the last 4 years combined. So that's a really significant ask, and I want to be really clear that it's an immense sacrifice, not only on behalf of the public, but also, frankly, on behalf of the people we have running the city. And we need to be really realistic about the impact on services that it has on the long term and long run. And if that wasn't said at some point, that would be irresponsible not to, because that's a reality. We all need to have very much in front of our faces, because it is important. It is something we've prioritized. It is something we've put value on, but it doesn't. I said earlier, there's no prioritization. If we do this is a massive prioritization of our funding, and it's not a prioritization that lasts for 1 or 2 years. It's a 20-year bond. So I want us all to be really, really clear about that too. With that in mind, I think what might be good for us is to have a conversation with people that we think are going to be responsible for fundraising. Is that what I'm gleaning to? We've got the environmental piece working forward, the engineering piece working forward, the funding piece is the sort of missing item. What are the consequences of us having those conversations between now, and I know everybody wants to talk about it over turkey, but the first meeting in December, to see if there's any chance there can be some kind of convening of those folks, looking out there, to have a conversation about what seems reasonable from a timeline perspective, and maybe to walk through this with those people that we've already identified as fundraisers, and walk through this timeline and explain it. And instead of us telling them, maybe have them also give some feedback to us about what is feasible and reasonable. Does that sound right?
Who's in charge of putting together this fundraising committee?
That's a great question for the community. I'm putting this out here to you folks who are sitting here today. I mean, I think the key is the city really can't fundraise. I mean, I think we can provide that information, that material. We can unlock the doors to the building, turn the lights on, and have somebody, here to help you.
Because I know when this committee was formed, it was, we had to apply.
Yes.
That whole thing. So basically, this committee can seek out and form their own fundraising committee?
I don't think that there's any, I think the only question we would have is if we're blending any type of funds from the outside, if there's any restrictions that we should make people aware of from source of fundraising. I can't imagine that there is, because we're not using federal funds and.
No, the restriction would be placed by them that this was raised for the pool, it goes toward the pool.
Yeah, and
It would be held by a foundation anyway.
and that's what I was gonna say. I mean,
Right.
I'm not gonna give legal advice here, but we can have a conversation. But I mean, there's tax implications, et cetera. What you thinking?
Can I ask just a historic question that I should know the answer to? Was the pool committee appointed by the council?
Actually, I think it was the Community Services Commission, because they're actually underneath the Community Services Commission.
Okay.
Yeah.
That walks a very fuzzy line about open meeting law, but okay.
Next step would be to talk to the people who we know might be fundraisers. That sounded like people there versus these people here. Is that a different group or is that the same?
Well, I just haven't heard anybody pull out their checkbook today. I mean, if they want to write checks themselves, that's good to know. But what I've heard is like they've got.
People who would be fundraising.
Yeah,
I had an idea of some folks that should be added to this group.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a conversation that we can have from a community, that I know I'm happy to have as a community member about what might make sense of that. I think from the capacity of the council or staff kind of jumping into that in a formal arena, it gets a little dicier. So I think as community members, all of us.
I was just trying to understand, because at once it was like, we should start talking with these fundraising people. Then they said, we should have a committee, and you go, sounds good, go ahead.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure where the.
Some of our pool committee people are gonna have to be involved in the fundraising committee, because we know what's going on. We've been here from day one. I mean, it won't make any sense to start over again with another committee. I mean, I almost think our pool committee, if people want to volunteer to do that, all hands on deck, in my opinion, and then get that professional fundraiser leading us with some volunteers that we can make up that want to help out. I mean, I'm sure there's gonna be some boots on the ground for this anyway. But from the work and coming to these meetings, the knowledge that we have in this, I don't think we should be left out on that.
Yeah, and I think there should be I do think it would be good for us to have a structural conversation about what the timeline looks like from our perspective and what that is from a realistic standpoint. The other thing that I think needs to happen is that needs to be brought back here, and this group needs to, quite frankly, before people go off and do that, have a pretty firm understanding and commitment of what we're asking people to do, what the implications are of that in terms of our future commitments too. And that's where this gets dicey, right? Because this is a body that, quite frankly, could change. It could change by 3 in March potentially, and that's I think that's really important that we're speaking to you right now as community members. We're not giving marching orders. We're not building the infrastructure around those efforts. What happens in that kind of venue is outside of us. What's been expressed is that there's interest in doing fundraising, and that there's capacity to do that, and that could in some way help the pool come to completion. Giving the community an opportunity to do that is, I think, what we're saying. I think that would make Bob De Palma happy.
Can I make just a suggestion? So I would strongly suggest that the pool committee is sort of is no more or whatever. Because there are open meetings. I mean, the pool committee was a creation of the Community Services Commission, and they are an extension, and they're open meeting law and all that stuff. And the linkage with the city is too present. I mean, I guess what I would say is, don't we want to invite the folks in the community who have agreed that the pool is a priority and they need to, they want to take the lead on a fundraising initiative to come back to council at a specific date and present us with what they believe is a realistic timeline, which will inform our discussions around our timeline.
That's exactly what I was talking about, them talking about it over turkey.
Right.
So
We have a meeting on December 4th, and we have a meeting 2 weeks after that?
On December 18th.
On December 18th. So I would invite this group to notify the city manager when you think you're gonna be ready to present to council, and on the 4th or the 18th of December.
But we can't call ourselves the Winooski Pool Committee anymore.
You can call yourself something else.
Underneath the
Right.
Winooski umbrella.
You would be a new,
It's like Friends of the Winooski Library,
yeah.
an independent nonprofit that contributes to the library on a, this might even be good people to talk to in terms of how they do what they do.
So it's just a matter of sort of dissolving the connection to the city if it's going to become a fundraising
Correct.
entity.
Well, you know, technically that has already been done. The commission determined that there could not be any connection with the pool committee upon the completion of the design component. And we recommended at that time that the pool committee reconstitute themselves to undertake fundraising and other duties or tasks that they think is necessary to complete the overall goal. So I think that technically there is no further connection with the pool committee from the city's point of view. We did dissolve that at the commission level.
And our attorneys appreciate that comment. That's good.
Especially on camera.
No, I mean, that's important. It's a really important distinction to make. Okay,
One
so.
thing I want to say before I leave, before I forget, too.
Yeah.
The stagnant of our committee, too, wasn't anyone's fault either. We had changes of the guard. Jesse came in. Jess, when did you start? In August?
March.
March. We did have a change in the guard, and Ray was wearing multiple hats. So our committee kind of, we got a little stalled out for that, but it was for no one's.
Right.
And that's fine.
I'll address that, and I'll be really blunt. And this is the seat that controls the agendas that come before this body and puts items on and asks staff to give updates and asks staff to provide prioritization lists. So in my estimation, if there's any failure, it's right here in terms of ensuring this stayed on time from a community conversation standpoint. And that it was brought out into the light enough. Sometimes you just know a committee's working and you wish you could attend them all and you wish you could, know every detail about where everybody is, but you do lose track. But that's totally on me. That's not even on this body. They haven't even had the opportunity to see something like this or have something like this demanded. So I appreciate that semblance, but I will also apologize that I think from my seat this should have been pushed harder and just frankly more closely watched. Sometimes you gotta hover on stuff. That's the way it is, and that's on me. So for that I apologize to all of you because I know you put a lot of blood, sweat, tears into it. So thank you for that, and we're gonna work really hard to make sure that's not for naught, and that this is given the full light of day and that we stay on schedule and have very productive, straightforward conversations going forward.
Thank you.
Yep. And we're sorry for your frustration because I think some of it's very warranted.
Well,
That's okay.
It's government. You gotta realize it's government. I'm like, let's go. Let's go. What's on the ground?
And so just to be really clear too, when that information comes back, I think what we're talking about then is going to be about the comfort level of that May deadline and pushing to and towards that. Okay, so I think from an informational standpoint, continuing to hash those details and information out in the background. I mean, it sounds like you guys have kind of done that. You're set up to do that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that we should just kind of poke at, and again, limited resources. I know we're gearing up for budget, but between now and then, if we can, is also take a look at what the secondary timeline would look like. Just so we're ready to have that conversation if it's there. If we come back and have this community conversation where either people say we can't raise any money between now and then, or we couldn't get a group together and it is what it is, and we're not comfortable moving forward and we need to take a look at that, we should know what that timeline looks like.
So
too.
meaning if we can't get to May for a bond vote and are pushed off,
Then what?
then what? Yep.
So yeah, a choose your own story opportunity.
Yep, exactly.
I guess, just my first night here.
Sure.
I'm really glad for all the work you guys have done. I actually want to help with it some more, really, tell my whole story. But the point is, looking at this, sounds like we can't fundraise until we get the report, which is in March. The water report, the ground report, until it's in March. Done some fundraising also, and so it sounds like we can either get a bond for 4.4, or we can raise as much as we can and get the rest in the bond, or we can get the bond and then raise some money and use that to pay off the loan, which is a little bit backwards because we're paying interest on the money that we've just raised up there. So, and we want it as soon as possible. I guess I'm seeing a lot of disconnect as far as, the way to make it go fast and get it done is just do the bond, and then like that. Then, and I know it's a raise money, once you've got the thing there, people are like, as far as fundraising goes, but it's like, you're gonna help put a pool in Winooski, then it's like, oh, okay, let's make that happen. But there's already a pool in Winooski, and we're fundraising 2 years after to sort of pay the debt or like get ahead on that. There's a lot less energy for that kind of fundraising. I guess I'm just trying to say what I'm seeing from this, because if we don't know if we can't go raise money unless we know we can do it. We don't know if we can do it until we see the results in March.
I guess I would counter that by saying I don't think fundraising is just like a switch that gets flipped. I think that there's a lot of ramp up to it that exists, and a lot, especially at the sophistication that we're talking about of putting a dent into something like this. So I think what would be good to hear back is what that looks like, and if there is capacity there, and with those knowns and unknowns. And I won't say anything more about fundraising. I think there might be people out there that might have an idea of how to address the fact that there's an uncertainty at a couple other levels and layers. There's ways that might be able to be addressed, I guess, is what I've seen in fundraising. But I do appreciate that. The reality is going to be we're not going to make any kind of decision tonight at any juncture. We actually legally can't, right? We're on a discussion item anyway. So the best that we could do is vote on something, in terms of saying go march forward on the May piece is in December anyway. So hopefully there can be a conversation ahead of there that better informs what decision might come.
Clearly, there's a lot of groundwork that can be done for fundraising, and that should happen. But even if it's all done and it's all in place, hitting the switch in March, whenever the report comes back, saying, yes, we can fundraise, that's still in March, April, May. It's like 2 months. I don't think, unless it's all like people are teetering, waiting for that to happen. It sounds like
I think a lot of times people get I can tell you with the community center, very similar. There were commitments made. That's what people did. Right, and they were subject to, and that's how everybody got. I imagine that the pool's just going to be this giant area with plaques on everything. When you go to the water fountain, there's going to be.
You're going to need tiles for the room, the changing room.
Paid for the toilet.
That's right. Wow, I got the good stuff.
Yeah,
Hey, that's what it takes, that's what we do.
exactly.
I think
Exactly.
if we're thinking through how these puzzle pieces fit into place, though, the discussions, like, we could not move forward with putting something on a May bond vote without having a clear understanding of the balance between fundraising, external fundraising, and the municipal commitment.
I guess that was kind of my question is like, can you, if we're like, all right, we're gonna raise one of the 4 million, do you make a bond for only 3? So what if we don't raise that money, then?
Well, I think
guess
those are future
I-
discussions to have, and right now, the charge for next steps isn't, okay, people who are going to be doing this fundraising work, go out and come back in December with the council and start showing us checks that are piling up at all. It's, what is putting together what a fundraising plan would look like as this engineering work is going on to really hit the ground running when it does make sense to start those asks. And also what is a realistic capacity for fundraising so that we know how all these numbers play into each other.
We kind of got that, actually. We did that at one of our meetings with one of a retired professional fundraiser, City of Burlington. He brought us in a pamphlet. It's like a 8x10 folder. And we have a kind of an idea of what way we're going to go and how we're going to set it up. But like Ron said, we have to get our ducks in a row because that one duck that's out, it's going to mess everything up. It's going to be harder for us to go back to that same donor if, we failed the first time. They're going to be even more on point with us. So that's the key part, getting the package together, organized, and the presentation needs to be on spot.
All right, I think from our perspective and thinking through what I mean by a fundraising plan is, what is the capacity, how are you going to go about collecting the money, not necessarily what are the, actually what your fundraising plan is for individual donor meetings. So if your fundraising plan also sets out a timeline saying, okay, when we get this piece of information from the engineering report, then that will plug into this next step that we're taking. And here's our overall 1-year plan for how we're going to gear up the fundraising. If it's your fundraising committee, whatever you end up calling it, this is our 1-year plan for how we're going to gear up, and here are our goals that we think are realistic and feasible as well.
It sounds like you know a lot about this.
Wait till he's not sitting in front of a plaque.
Please.
Are you guys, is everybody okay with that path?
Yeah.
You good with that path? Any concerns?
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of groundwork and a lot of hierarchy that needs to be built within a committee like that, and that can all start when you guys get home and pick up the telephone. But you're right, you can't really do much in directing this until we know what the ground is gonna allow. That's right.
We good? Do you guys,
This was incredibly helpful to us, I think, so thank you for having the conversation.
cathartic
Thank
for
you
all?
for this, because this was helpful for us as well.
Right. So, any other comments, questions from council? Seeing and hearing none, that closes that discussion item. We have one other item on tonight's agenda, which is executive session that was related to the deliberative session that is no longer necessary for the FOP hearing. So with that, I entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Nicole, second by Eric. Any further discussion? Hearing seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? Motion carries.
Oh, sorry.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks for all your time and work. We appreciate it.
Very constructive.
Jumping in.
Very constructive.
Oh, I was gonna go, and I was so gonna go, and then I was.
Get together.
So I think in terms of that.
What's that?
I think certainly like it's helpful.
You know, it's frustrating.